Enan, why don't you come up and tell something about the Reverend?
Well, that was our speaker, so no. Well, we're in for a fun treat, and hopefully you all read his resume. It's quite a resume. He's a Dr. Daniel Bunn Jr. He's at ORU, associate professor of the Old Testament. But what I really want to say is that our own Kayla Canfield thinks the world of this guy, and she's sorry she can't be here today, but she's preaching at both services today. So she did send me a little email, and she said, Daniel's witty sense of humor is my favorite. He also does a podcast and a Substack. How many know what a Substack is? Wow, okay, you're ahead of me. That deserves a plug. For anyone wanting to read his reflections, his Substack is at Daniel Bunn Jr. His podcast is the Good Book Podcast, in which he walks through books of the Bible one by one with his brother. And I did listen to one yesterday. They're fantastic. He said, Kayla says, I'm not sure he will plug his own stuff, so I will. Enjoy your time with him. I wish I could be there. So, Daniel, come on.
Well, that means a lot. I think the world of Kayla, and a little jealous that she came over here with you guys, but that's okay. That's okay. So, well, today we are going to talk about who is in and who is out as far as God's people is concerned. I thought I better think of something scintillating, scandalous sounding for the conversation here. What I want to do in particular is I want to look at one moment in the Old Testament that sort of wrestles with this very issue. And it's a moment I would suggest on the surface looks like it's saying one thing, but then maybe if we dig a little deeper, we'll see there might be more than meets the eye. So the texts we're going to be looking at, if you want to follow along, I'll be reading, though, it's Joshua chapter 1 and chapter 2. Joshua chapter 1 and chapter 2. Also, along the way, if you have any questions of clarification, feel free to shout out. I'm used to lots of discussion in the conversations I lead. You won't offend me, I promise. All right, so I'm going to start reading in Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. Before I read that, just a little bit about this. When you hear conversations about the Old Testament in either maybe its exclusivity, the way it thinks of God's people as special, and the way it maybe thinks of outsiders as, sort of either wrong or evil or bad, etc. This very much this us versus them mindset. When those conversations come up, the book of Joshua is often near the top of the list as one of the books that seems to reinforce that idea, that there are God's special people and everyone else, God's about to wipe out, God could care less about. And rightly so. If you've read Joshua, there's some, it's not totally innocent as far as that conversations go. But what I want to do is I want to look a little more closely and try to ask, what is the book of Joshua trying to do to us as readers, especially as it gets us to think about that exact topic. So I'm going to start reading in Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness in the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. The book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Okay, so this is the opening scene to the book of Joshua, and a little background if you're not familiar what's just happened. Moses, the one who's been leading this people for the last 4 books of the Bible, has died. That means there's no leader in place for this people. They're going to have questions about who's leading us forward. So here, the opening scene of this book, the Lord comes and speaks to Joshua and says, I will be with you. In that, did you hear anything that was repeated in what the Lord was saying to Joshua? There was something repeated 3 times in there. Be strong and courageous. 3 times the Lord said, be strong and courageous, right? Be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. Oh, and by the way, be strong and courageous, right? Now, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I am smart enough to know that I think the Lord is really concerned about him being strong and courageous. That's my guess. He really, really wants to drive that home. Now, I would suggest that he wants to drive that home suggests that there might be reason for him not to be strong and courageous in the days ahead. And likewise, we have to remember we're readers reading this book. The one telling us this story is speaking to us as well through these words. Going into this book, you have to be strong and courageous. That's what this book is going to be concerned with. It really wants you to learn what it means to be strong and courageous. Now, when you hear that language of be strong and courageous, what comes to mind? The English words, strong and courageous. What do you think of? Any thoughts? War? Power? Don't let anything deter you? Yeah, you might even think, like, if you had to describe it physically, you might think of some man that's like 6'8" with bulging biceps and, right, can lift 1,000 pounds. Strong, right? Powerful. Those words, strong and courageous, certainly invite us to think about those things. But what's interesting is the way the book then uses these words, because you might have caught this, but if not, we're going to look at it again. In the second occurrence of this phrase, in verse 7, the Lord says, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. So do you hear what the Lord has just done? He has identified being strong and courageous with being faithful to the words that the Lord had commanded to Moses. Now that's kind of an interesting way to talk about being strong and courageous in terms of obedience and faithfulness. So he's already sort of taken maybe the ideas we brought with us when we hear the word strong and courageous and kind of subverted them a little bit. In this book, being strong and courageous is going to be tied to being obedient and trusting in the Lord. And then further, at the end, the third occurrence, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened or dismayed. So the opposite of being strong and courageous is being frightened or dismayed. So this opening scene of the book invites us readers into a story in which we know already now, we're going to be exploring, will people be strong and courageous, marked by trusting in the Lord, or will they be frightened and dismayed? That's what we're being invited to accept as we go into this story. And then, of course, to see ourselves in that. What will it mean for us to be strong and courageous, to trust in the Lord, to adhere to the words commanded, etc., etc.? Will we do that, or will we be frightened and dismayed? That's the invitation. So that's the opening scene. Now, right after this in chapter 1, I'm just going to summarize what happens next. Joshua hears these words from the Lord, and he conveys them to the people of Israel. He very faithfully conveys them. And one of the funnier moments in the Old Testament, we don't get too many of those, but they're more than you might realize. So he's just said, this is what the Lord has said, be strong and courageous, be faithful. And here's what the people say. In verse 16, they answered Joshua, all that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Okay, some of you got the joke, right? I mean, if you've read anything that's come before Joshua chapter 1, what are you thinking when you hear them saying, just as we obeyed Moses, we're going to obey you, right? They didn't really have, let's say, the best track record of obeying Moses. So as readers, we might think, okay, do you know what you're saying there, right? We might have question about whether they really are sincere in what they're saying here. Because the track record we've seen with this particular people group is they certainly trust in the Lord when things are going well. And the minute things start to look terrifying around them, they lose hope. What, did you bring us out into the desert to kill us? Is that why you brought us out here? This is what they say over and over, right? So we might be skeptical about what they're going to do going forward. But they didn't stop there, though. Here's what they say after that. Whoever rebels against your orders and disobeys your words, whatever your command, shall be put to death. I mean, they're so confident, they up the ante. Just put someone to death if they don't. Oh, no. We might be thinking, you're setting yourself up for failure here because we've seen you before. Okay, so this is chapter 1. This is the opening to this book. It gets us to think, it already invites us into a certain story. It's about being strong and courageous, which means trusting in the Lord, doing what the Lord says, not being frightened or dismayed. But at the same time, we might be, as readers, and we tend to do this, we read the Bible as, we tend to associate ourselves with the protagonists in stories. Have you noticed this? When we read the story in the Bible, we think of ourselves in the light of, in the eyes of we rarely think of ourselves as the Pharisees, for instance. We start with, we're Jesus, we're the disciples. Yeah, those Pharisees over there. We don't. So likely as readers, we're thinking at this moment, you can imagine us or an ancient audience, all of us. All right, now let's go into the land of Canaan, and it's us with God on our side, and we're going to go in and we're going to wipe out all these Canaanites. We just need to be strong and courageous. That's what this book is going to be about. That's what we might think. It's all about us versus them. Well, this is where things then take an interesting turn, because the very next chapter, chapter 2, this is what I want to read now, where we're going to focus our attention today. So this is right after all that framing, right after sort of inviting us into thinking about us versus them, Israel versus Canaan, etc. Here's what happens next. Chapter 2, verse 1. Then Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and spent the night there. Okay, I'm going to pause right there. Couple things for you. And these are just questions to consider. I'm not wanting to read between the lines too much, but it's something it took me years of sitting with this text finally even to ask these 2 questions. The first question, why is Joshua sending spies into the land? Is that an act of strength and courage? It's at least worth asking. I'm not trying to throw Joshua in the mud or suggest, but it's just interesting. The very first thing he does after the Lord says, be strong and courageous, is he sends in spies. And why would you send in spies? To check out the land and see how big a boy are you, if you will. How big of a threat are these people? I mean, that was the previous reason for sending in some spies to assess the land. But I don't want to push too hard on that. The other bigger question, why are they going to a prostitute's house? Why is that the first thing they do when they go into the land of Canaan? Again, from my childhood, being sort of acquainted with this story, which again, it's always funny, the stories where I remember growing up saying, you can't watch R-rated movies, you need to read the Bible. So I did. Oh boy, did I. But this is one of those stories I'm so familiar with that I just take for granted. Okay, they went to a prostitute's house. Yeah, so what? It, again, took me years of stopping that. Why are they going to a prostitute's house? There are a couple reasons why you might go to a prostitute's house. It's worth asking, why are they going to a prostitute's house? And one of the bigger questions then related to that is, are they even very good spies? Because look at what happens next. Verse 2, the king of Jericho was told, some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land. I mean, they're not the best at staying secretive if that's their goal here. The king and all the people know by verse 2. I mean, they didn't last very long. Okay, so verse 3, then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come only to search out the whole land. But the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Then she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when it was time to close the gate at dark, the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them. She had, however, brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax that she had laid out on her roof. So the men pursued them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. As soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Interesting, right? What does she do here when the king comes to her door and asks where these spies are? growing up, the word I was given for what she does here, she lies, right? That's the theological word for this, the academic theological word. She lies. Yeah, they did come here, but they went that way. But we know she's hidden them on her roof. So she's protected them. And we don't, as readers, we don't know yet why, but she has protected them and lied to her king. Now, I mean, that's a risky move. If the king eventually finds out what happens, you can imagine she's putting herself at risk. Okay, so she's hid them. Verse 8, before they went to sleep, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that dread of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you. The Lord your God is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below. Okay, so we now hear her explanation of why she's done what she did. And does anything stand out to you all in terms of what she says? Why did she do what she did? She wants to be on the winning side. She acknowledges that mighty things have been happening on behalf of this people, and she's wanting to associate herself with them. Yes. Anything else? Maybe the Holy Spirit is involved in prompting this. Okay. Yeah. So what's interesting about this moment, a couple things coming to it. How does she know this about God? And what leads to her having this sort of reaction to the news that she's heard? It's an interesting question. I mean, we can imagine practically like some reports probably spread, and she probably came across that. She's living in the city gates, so she's hearing, she's a prostitute, lots of people coming to her house. Maybe she's heard the stories. But what's interesting is she could have responded to those stories in different ways. She could have responded by saying, our people, we're mightier than you. You're no threat. But instead, she recognizes something about who this God is that's working on behalf of these people. She has some sort of insight into who this God is. And the question is, how did she get to that point? We're not really told. As readers, we're just sort of maybe like these Israelites, surprised. Because again, we've come to, so pulling back for a second, we've come to this house of, right after having heard about being strong and courageous as the Israelites go against the Canaanites. In the very first character we encounter, she's a woman, and she's a prostitute, and she's from Jericho. In many ways of reckoning within this context, she would have been an outsider 3 times over, right? She's not a powerful male Israelite. She's a woman who's a prostitute, and she's from Jericho. She is a true outsider. She should have no sense, in that way of thinking of things and reckoning things. She shouldn't have any sense of who this God is. She's an outsider. And yet here she is. She recognizes this God has been working on your behalf. And then what was the statement she made there at the very end of what I just read? In verse 11, the Lord your God is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below. Now, this might be easy to overlook, but if you're looking in your Bible, you might notice where it says the Lord your God. It's all capitals, Lord. Does anyone happen to know have you noticed that before? And then if you've noticed it, does anyone know what's going on? Why all capitals Lord? Does anyone know by chance? Yes. So the issue behind this in the Hebrew, this is where we get the divine name, the name of God that God revealed to Moses back in Exodus 3. It's a name that out of reverence isn't typically spoken out loud. It's the name. And so when it shows up, it's the name of God. It's not like a title. It's the actual name of God that he gave to Moses. Now, because Jewish people out of practice started not saying the name in reverence, they ran into this situation where they would read with their eyes the name, but then they would want to say something else out loud. And so the word they came to say instead was Adonai, which means Lord. So in our English translations, in an attempt to call attention to this without putting the divine name in there, translators typically put Lord, all capitals, to remind you that this isn't just the title Lord, it's actually the name of God here. So what's interesting then, who is saying this name in this moment in the story? It's that woman who's a prostitute from Jericho, and she's calling on God by the name that he revealed to Moses. She's saying something very intimate about this God. So she's not just saying your God, she's calling this God by name. And she then further declares, he is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now, this is an interesting picture. This is a bold statement. She doesn't just say, wow, there's this powerful God working on your behalf. She's making very bold statements about who this God is. Statements that, in fact, if you compare to what the Israelites have said and done so far, stand out. They've watched, right? They watched as God worked on behalf of them in delivering them from Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And yet still, the very next thing they did, they turned around and they saw this vast desert open before them. And they said, what are we going to drink? What are we going to eat? They just literally watched the waters split in two, and they're worried about where water and food are going to come from. Here's a woman that hasn't seen any of this firsthand, and she is an outsider. She's not someone who's been invited to the center for these conversations. And yet she calls on this God by name, and she says something bold about who this God is. She makes a bold declaration about this God. So she has this deep sense, in other words, of who this God is. She's saying things that the Israelites should be saying, but she, the woman prostitute from Jericho, gets, and they don't. So that's what she says, and then that leads into verse 12 and following. She now explains some more about her actions. She says, now then, since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me by the Lord that you in turn will deal kindly with my family. Okay, so in my translation, it has deal kindly. Other translations might have show kindness, something about loyalty. There's a range of words that get used to describe this Hebrew word that shows up here. Now, I'm rarely someone who likes to quote the Hebrew with the Greek and sort of hold that over you because, I don't like to do that. But this is one of those moments where this word is really interesting that gets translated here. In Hebrew, it's one of those words where you have to start down in your throat. It's hesed. Hesed. This word hesed, it does have the sense of dealing kindly, showing kindness, loyalty. Those are all good words. But what's important is this word is the word that's used over and over again to describe what God does for God's people. It's the commitment, the loyalty, the kindness God shows to God's people. So it's this sort of permanent, everlasting commitment to work on their behalf, to do kind things for them, to act on their behalf. Even when they fail to do hesed back, God still does it for them. So this is a really rich theological word. So what's going on then? Who's the one talking about doing hesed, doing kindness? Again, it's the prostitute from Jericho. She's describing what she just did on their behalf as an act of hesed. In other words, let me put it a little more directly. She's saying, I just acted like your God acts. I in light of what I just said about who your God is, I'm showing that my actions, I've actually shaped my life to where I'm now doing the things your God does. I have such a sense of who your God is based on what I've heard that I'm acting like that God now. So this, again, really rich language she's using. And what's interesting, so again, like this is that part in the story where people say, well, she's negotiating, she had an ulterior motive, etc. But yes, she's negotiating for her and her family's lives. But notice she did this before she talked to them. She didn't first get them to sign on the dotted line and commit to doing something in return. She did it without knowing for sure that they would return the favor. So even though she does want to ask for this favor, this kindness to be shown to her, she did it without any guarantee that would happen. She just did it. That's just how she acted. So she's now described, again, just to summarize what she's saying here. She offers up to this point, one of the clearest and boldest declarations of who this God is. And then she follows that by saying, because I've seen your God, I now act like your God. Her life has been changed. Now, again, I ask, for the Israelites coming into this and for us coming into this as readers, how did she get to that point? How did she even get to that point? There might be a tendency to assume that the Israelites were the ones who would come in and tell these Canaanites about God, right? They were the ones who would bring the gospel, if you will. They're going to reach the lost people of Canaan. And until they show up, in other words, God can't show up. But what this story invites us to see, they get there, and it turns out God got there before they got there. God was already at work in this woman's life, and we don't get to know how. There's a mystery to it. In other words, if you come into this story thinking, okay, well, I need to go be the one to bring God to these people, and you find out, oh, God actually went there ahead of me, and I don't know how. I don't know how that happened. It invites a dramatic shift in perspective. It's no longer me bringing God to these people. If anything, it's me showing up and seeing where God is already at work and getting on board with what God is doing. God is ahead of me. So in this moment, for instance, the question is, will the Israelites in this story and will us as readers be willing to get on board with the fact that God has been present with this woman who's a prostitute from Canaan, from Jericho? Can we get on board with that? Can we have this sort of conversion in our mind and our thinking that allows for God to be at work even among someone like that? That's the challenge these Israelites and then us as readers face in that moment. So we don't know how she encountered this God. We just know that it's happened. We don't know when. We don't know where. It's just she demonstrates she's had this encounter with God. So pulling back for a second now and looking at sort of the bigger picture and thinking about this, we again, there are many reasons why we might have come into this text. The Israelites themselves might have come into this text thinking that they would go among the Canaanites and find only the foulest, most wicked people they've ever encountered. And they, on the other hand, were the good, righteous ones. And right away, first of all, we have some questions about these particular two men. They're going to a prostitute's house. But then second, she demonstrates that she actually is not. She doesn't fit into those boxes. Now, a little background to this even, back in Deuteronomy, in a well-known passage in Deuteronomy, the Lord had said to them, when you go into that land, don't, show them no mercy. Wipe them out. When you encounter the Canaanites, just obliterate them. Well, here, they're encountering this woman who's a prostitute from Jericho. She's a Canaanite. What do they do with something like Deuteronomy 7? Do they wipe her out? Even though they've seen that she shows this sort of insight into who God is? Well, ultimately, what do? They make an agreement with her, and she's not only saved, her family is saved, and she's blessed beyond this. She shows up again in terms of, throughout the Bible, she's talked about for her faith, for her trust in who God is, her understanding of who God is. So this book shows us, in other words, in this moment, as we come to these texts, if we came in with this really oversimplified idea of who's in and who's out, that might be marked by the way we look, the way we dress, the way we talk, that kind of gets shattered here in these first two chapters. Instead, having been told in chapter 1 about be strong and courageous, trust in the Lord, the narrator immediately takes us to this woman who by all accounts was an outsider to show us what it means to be strong and courageous. This is what it looks like. This outsider, she actually shows that she's a true insider, and she's welcomed as such by God. So she challenges our simple ideas and even the way we begin to determine who's in and out. She shows herself to be a true insider. A little later in Joshua, a couple things interesting related to this. In chapter 5, there's this well-known episode where Joshua, it's on the eve of the battle in Jericho. Joshua encounters this mysterious figure, and Joshua poses this question to this figure. We readers know it's some sort of angelic or some sort of non-human being who's sent by God. And Joshua asks, basically, are you for us or are you against us? Are you on our side or are you on their side? And you might remember the response of this being, I'm on neither. I'm on the Lord's side. So again, if you come into this with simple ideas of it's us versus them, that guy challenges that way of thinking. And then one further step in this, after Jericho has been destroyed, we have a man named Achan, or Achan, as you might pronounce it, who is a male Israelite. And do you remember what happens with this man, Achan, by chance? Not one of those popular stories you hear, you're reading every day in your devotionals or whatever, but he takes some of what was supposed to be destroyed for himself. And there are consequences for that. So in other words, he looks on the outside like an insider because he's a male Israelite. And yet his actions, contrasting with Rahab, show him to be an outsider. So do you see what the book of Joshua is doing? Within the first section of this book, it sort of walks you into a trap. Yeah, this is about who's in and who's out. That's definitely what we're exploring in this book. But then right away it shows you, but we're not determining that based on your criteria. We're using a different criterion. It's about trusting in the Lord. It's about responding positively to the Lord and knowing that the Lord is good in working on your behalf if you will trust in this God, etc. And so right away we see just because someone looks like an outsider doesn't mean they can't in fact be a true insider. And just because they look like an insider doesn't guarantee that they're truly an insider. They could be an outsider. So it's as readers, it would have the effect on us, at least one of the effects it would have on us, is it causes us to relinquish control. We don't get to go out and tell God where God gets to work, and we don't get to go out and tell God how God's going to go about doing the work that God wants to do. God welcomes the outsiders. God is present with those who we've pushed to the fringes. And sometimes those who are closest to the center, they demonstrate that they truly have not come to know God yet. Now, hearing it framed in that way likely might make you think of another well-known character in the Bible, this guy named Jesus. I'm assuming you all have heard. I've heard things about this type of church, so I never know. No, I'm just kidding. You might think of Jesus because if you look at the life of Jesus over and over again, what's he doing, right? Well, he goes among those who are supposed to be near the center, the leaders, the religious leaders. They're supposed to know God and know Moses' teaching, etc. And they continue to show they don't get it. But then he goes in among those on the fringes, the lepers, the blind, the poor, and they regularly see it. They get it. This is what's happening even back in Joshua. Jesus is just taking forward that thread of that God is at work among those who are humble, and God's way of determining who's in and out is based on how one responds to God. Not does one meet all the right physical, religious, social, categories that we've applied. One text in particular that I want to look at in the New Testament, where some of this comes to the surface, is Matthew 15. Matthew 15, in a well-known text, and we won't have time to get into all the details of this, but in Matthew 15, verse 21 and following, Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from the region came out. Now, I want to pause there for a second. You might, if you know where this text is going, you remember this text. But one interesting detail here is Jesus calls this woman a Canaanite woman. Does anyone happen to know why that's interesting? Well, it's interesting because there are no Canaanite women at the time of Jesus. That's no longer a way of framing these people. So it's just anachronistic. Like they're no longer called the Canaanites. That's just like And so when Matthew tells us Canaanite, that's a clue to what's going on here. There's something else going on here. He's taken us back, for instance, to books like Joshua, where the Canaanites were in the land. Now, before I go any further even with this particular story, if you had something like Deuteronomy 7 in front of you, show the Canaanites no mercy, wipe them out, etc. They're outsiders, we're insiders. How should Jesus respond when he meets a Canaanite woman? If he just follows the Bible, right? Well, he should wipe her out, right? Well, let's see what he does. All right, so she comes and she starts shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Now, this text has merited lots of conversation over the years about what's Jesus doing here, and there are a couple different interpretations of why he says what he says. Don't want to get into all that right now. But at the end of the day, what's interesting is ultimately he says, your faith is great, and he doesn't wipe her out, as Deuteronomy said, which suggests Jesus himself was wise enough to know that Deuteronomy 7 was never really just about go wipe out the Canaanites. It always had to be a much deeper and more nuanced than that. And Jesus, just like in the book of Joshua with Rahab, shows that he is determining who has responded appropriately by, do they trust in God? Do they see what God is up to or not? Not, do they have the right physical characteristics, the right language, etc. He already shows that the way someone is determined to be an insider versus outsider is based on different criteria. So, sort of wrapping some of this conversation up, and then I want to leave time for any questions that you all might have. Looking at Joshua, we might be inclined to think that it's just reinforcing this idea that God's special people are marked by physical characteristics, certain language, etc. And I don't want to diminish that God has been at work among certain people groups in different ways, different times. But at the same time, if we go into Joshua thinking it's just reinforcing that it's us versus them, we are called to go out and tell people, are they in or out? We're the ones who bring God. All of that, I would suggest, actually gets subverted if you look below the surface. That even Joshua, the book itself, is inviting us to see, be strong and courageous is embodied by this prostitute from Jericho. And if she can embody that, who else could be? Who else among us, when we encounter people that we have deemed outsiders, what if we're dealing with a true insider? And if we've deemed them insiders like Achan, what if they're truly outsiders? What if they're posturing themselves to be working against the things that God is doing? The end result, hopefully, is more humility for all of us. Rather than thinking we are called to go in and be gatekeepers, determiners of truth, etc., we're just invited to go out and see where God is at work and how God is at work, and to get on board when that happens. A similar New Testament moment in the book of Acts. The early disciples are going out and they're proclaiming that Christ has been raised. And right away they're surprised because all these Gentiles are responding positively. And they come to this point, which for us is just sort of like a duh moment, but they're like, even the Gentiles are able to be a part of God's people. And they're having to go, even the disciples are experiencing this ongoing conversion. Their minds have to be expanded to see just how big and great God's mercy is, and how even those we had deemed outsiders can actually be insiders. That's how gracious and merciful God is. Okay, I want to pause there and leave time for any questions or concerns. Any thoughts from you all?
Well, this whole immigration thing going on in our country right now, the folks that need to be out because we're the in people, it's just so disheartening. And so many of those folk proclaim to be Christian. And anyway, I don't really have a particular question. It's just a heartache. And it makes me angry. And I want to kick some butt. And we're suffering because of it. You know, where are the workers? Blah, blah, in that whole thing. So folks taking the right to decide who can stay, who can't, who's in, who's out, who's good, who's bad. It's just, we better look out for a big thunderbolt coming from above. Anyway, so I'm just sort of ranting here.
No, but in that conversation, it's so easy to posture ourselves as in certain ways, we're the determiners of these sorts of things. And again, like this text speaking into that moment, if nothing else, hopefully invites us to have a little dose of humility that God is at work, and we don't even know how often, and where, and we should be looking for that. In my own experience, it's amazing how often most of the deepest encounters I've had with the work of God have come in the form of like interruptions, where it's dealing with someone again that I've deemed an outsider, or a situation that seems to interrupt the real thing I need to be doing. And when no credit here, I just am sort of forced to engage the situation, and then I'm humbled in the process to see, oh wow, God was at work in this, and I was too busy trying to do the work of God, to encounter God. Yeah, it's humbling. Yes.
So the prostitute. It seems to me she was an insider because she knew so many people, and they taught her to be that. I mean, it's not. I mean, she just knew a lot of people. It's for those that they didn't have TV or social media then, so it had to be personal knowledge. But is there something in the Bible that said because she was a prostitute, it was a bad thing? Because that's the way she made her living, right? So
Yeah.
What's wrong with being a prostitute?
So, yeah, no. So, and there's the added layer to this that often in the ancient context, it was forced. Which again, we could talk about modern day prostitution and how it's not necessarily so neutral. And then also it was often tied into religious contexts. So there's so many layers to it, But what's interesting is, we are not told that we're not told one way or the other, is she still engaging in the work of being a prostitute, even though she is, did she have this sort of encounter in this eye-opening moment, and has that redirected, we're just not told. But it definitely doesn't. Let me put it this way. This text is not about the conversion of some sort of prostitute. She had already had her mind expanded to encounter God in this way. But yeah, and she's not the only one who, we meet other women in the Bible and other men as well who, again, they're on the fringes and they're doing these they're connected with certain activities and so forth that we struggle with. Yeah.
How contemporary is the account that you've given us to the actual events? In other words, how many hundreds of years separated them from not now, but this morning, and then going forward?
So just to make sure I'm hearing you right, the account of the event compared to the actual event itself, the distance between those two? Okay. So yeah, and this is an important question that we often, I think, forget to ask. In all likelihood, the writing and reading of this story was several hundred years after the event itself. So it wasn't like people reading this are like, oh yeah, Rahab, she lives over here, right? They didn't know, they didn't know her hundreds of years beforehand. So yeah, does that?
That answers one question. The next question is, how contemporary is this to today?
How contemporary? So in terms of just time?
Do you think that they're reading this in the Knesset and before they map out the next plan?
Oh, okay, yeah. So no. So this is one interesting thing about this text and all of the book of Joshua, is it's never been a book addressed to people who are like actually coming into the land and trying to determine what's going on. It was already written hundreds of years after all that. So it was always about something else. It was getting them to think about something else. It wasn't like, here's the game plan for us going in and taking over Canaan. In fact, at least the book of Joshua is clearly connected to Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Not saying that it was necessarily written all together, but it's clearly been connected. So in its final form that we have the person who wrote 2 Kings sort of at least editing Joshua. And they're writing at the time of exile. So they may no longer be in the land. The Canaanites aren't real people they're dealing with anymore. So it's not like a game plan for what do we do about these Canaanites around us. Does that make sense at all?
Thank you.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Kevin.
Oh, wait for the mic.
Also, I guess, a little bit in the defense of women. But this era and this time, unless a woman was attached to a man, be it a father or a husband that could care for her, her employment options were limited.
Mhm.
And so a lot of
Yeah.
women, and I'm sure some of that's true today to a certain level and a certain extent,
Mhm.
but we, especially in this country and many parts of the world, women have many options today. So prostitution to be viewed at that time, although it wasn't a desirable employment,
Mhm.
some women had to do that to survive and even to feed their children and so forth.
Mhm.
So I always look at that and I find it interesting in the Old and the New Testament. There's included women who were in prostitution.
Mhm.
There's a reason for that, I think, for it,
Mhm.
as you just said, the humbling part of it,
Mhm.
but also the fact that we can respect the fact that these women were making choices that were not necessarily choices that we would have the options for today. So
Yeah.
we have to be careful how
Yeah.
we judge that, I think.
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating. Again, this is an ancient text. I don't want to pretend it's modern and its thinking every way. But first of all, that it presents a woman in such positive light is really interesting. But then also, it doesn't evaluate. It doesn't. And again, that's where I've heard sermons on this or talks on this text that try to, because in our modern context, we want to speak morally and ethically about prostitution. Yeah, that's just not the focus. The text, I mean, by implication, she's encountered God as a prostitute. So it's not like she first had to leave prostitution behind before she could encounter God. She's encountered God as a prostitute. So it just doesn't seem to be as concerned as we might be to distance her from that before we say that she's had this real transformation with God. Does that make sense? And then, yeah, just adding to it that, again, the choices. It's not like, yeah, it doesn't evaluate her ethically before this moment. The text just isn't concerned with that, and that's interesting.
I don't want to complicate this, but what's the definition of prostitution and what's the definition of adultery?
Good question. In ancient context and in new context. In the ancient context, again, there's such a tie-in even with religion, especially outside of Israel, that it was very common, for instance, for there to be temple prostitutes. That you would have sex with a temple prostitute as an act of worship. It wasn't considered like adultery. It wasn't put in those frames. So yeah, so in terms of adultery, when that shows up, it's speaking to a totally different situation. To call her a prostitute, it's just a different frame altogether. And adding to this, we don't know how old she is. There's a chance that at least when she first began as a prostitute, that she was younger. I mean, it's possible she was late teens. We just, from what we know about the ancient context, would not be surprising. So, again, it's not evaluating her morally and ethically as a prostitute. The text just doesn't. That's not what it's doing.
Another thing about Rahab that is interesting is that she's in the lineage of Jesus, and so when you go back, it's like, oh my goodness, he has a prostitute in his family. I mean, it's again speaks to the generosity and the benevolence and just the wide love of God.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't shy away from those things. It goes out of its way to emphasize those things, which is interesting. Yeah. Any other thoughts? He's hurrying.
This prostitute thing. I think prostitute labeling was man's desire or creation. And then, as we pointed out in that time of day, at that era, if you were not a woman supported by a husband or a father, what did they call you? And so the prostitute thing is like if people were forced upon her at a young age or an older age, it didn't really matter. They were taking advantage of her, and then to justify their actions, they label her a prostitute.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a great point. Where again, it just, the way this text, especially for those of us reading through the lens of Jesus, there's no judgment on her at this point about it. And it's just, again, even her getting to this position itself is because of other problems in the structures that she's a part of. That's why I think the text doesn't stop and just say, oh, she's a bad prostitute. We got to deal with that first, What was that? Uh-huh. Yeah, she did what Jesus later told us to do, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a good New Testament way of explaining that Hebrew word I was talking about. She's showing this kindness to them, even when she doesn't know that they will return the favor. And even knowing that they've come to her as a prostitute, I mean, it's so, she's not, she chose to act that way to them apart from any guarantee of how they would act back to her. Yes.
So again, introducing a woman into that scripture is important to show that there were both women and men on the earth at that time. If they hadn't chosen a woman, what would the man have been doing that he would have gone to that man's house? Those two spies. What would that man be in a similar position to what the woman was as a?
That's a good question. I mean, there were different forms of being outsider as a man. This is far away, but it's in the New Testament. But you think of some of the people Jesus encounters, even things like tax collectors, where they were relatively well off financially, but being an outsider in this context was more expansive than just financial well-being. And so he was an outsider. And so to associate, that's why they said he's eating with tax collectors. That was a big thing to them, which maybe it's still a big thing now. I don't know, but so it was sort of just even within this context where there's like shame, for instance, and social ostracization, associating with a prostitute, associating with a tax collector, associating with it makes you an outsider. And so but that's an interesting question. What if it were a man instead? What would that look like? Yes. Saw two hands here.
I don't know, this might be I don't mean to be causing an issue here, but just, I have a real issue with what's going on in our country today. And I think several others expressed that. And I appreciate what you've taught us today, but I can't square that with what I'm hearing from others. It seems like the balance has just gone totally the opposite of what you're teaching, what you've taught us, and I'm assuming what you're teaching at ORU. The people that are supposedly teaching and representing us are going just the opposite. So how do you square that? And understand.
It's to me, it's just the irony. It almost, you just feel like, is this just a big joke? I don't know if you all remember. There used to be a show Ashton Kutcher did called Punked. I don't know if you ever heard of that, where he would play these elaborate. And I'm like, is Ashton Kutcher going to walk out and say, "Punked, gotcha"? Because I'm like, do you not see how often we're seeing Christians today act just like the Pharisees we critique in the New Testament, in the way we posture in this regard? Insider, outsider, I'm the one who gets to determine these things. So if nothing else, the irony for me is, it at least makes me wonder, when we're posturing in that way, are we actually demonstrating that we may be more closer to being an outsider than an insider? Because we know that God is at work in the world. The question is, where is God at work? And when we see that sort of behavior, it's at least worth asking, that's not typically the people God associates with. God associates with the humble. So maybe those who are posturing themselves as insiders and gatekeepers need to look in the mirror. I don't know. It just feels, whatever your thoughts are on any particular topic or conversation, just that posturing itself, it's just rooted in pride and instead of humility. And that's just,
So Daniel.
Yes.
Prostitution is one of the oldest professions in employment or non-employment. The word prostitute or prostitution, Greek, Hebrew, where does it derive from?
Like the English word
The
prostitute.
name. Yes.
I'm not sure on the English word. Do you happen to know?
No, I do not.
I don't know on it. Obviously, in Hebrew and Greek, there are different words.
Yeah, you
that
go
get
Greek
used
and
for that.
Hebrew, in the Bible.
And even the
back
translation prostitute, any translation, I always say this to students, translation is always interpretation. So when an English translator chooses the English word prostitute to translate the Hebrew or the Greek, there's always some interpretation going on, and it's worth asking, is that what the Hebrew word is getting at? Is that what the Greek word is getting at, etc.? So, and it's not always a clear overlap. There's some, again, just some nuance that needs to be had. Jeff, 2 more minutes? Okay, 2 more minutes. Yes, Laurie. Uh-oh. She's coming for me.
This is not a question. I thought I'd end this on a light note. So this story of Rahab always reminds me of the scene in The Sound of Music when the captain and Maria are hiding the children in the abbey from the bad guys, and the nuns steal the carburetors from the bad guys' cars. Are you familiar with
Yeah.
Yeah. So that scene always reminds me of the Rahab story, but it was nuns lying to protect the good guys instead of the prostitutes. So it's sort of a theological humility in a sense. Yes, they're breaking the commandment of lying, but for a greater good.
Yeah, and it's amazing how often we see this in the Bible. God works through these ways. The midwives in Exodus, that's another one of my favorite stories where God works through these people and through these means that we often would deem, inappropriate or wrong, or you shouldn't lie no matter what. But when people are put in hard situations and the options are limited, they have to navigate with what's in front of them and make decisions to pursue good in light of what they're facing. It's a powerful example, powerful similarity. Yes.
Right now, we are called to be strong and courageous and to go into this land that we live in now that looks so foreign to us and anti-God to us. And so we're called now to be modern day Joshuas and to keep going forward. And there are ways we can stand up and protest what's going on. But anyway, so we are Joshuas today.
I appreciate that you said that, and even back to the comment about what do we do when we see it. One of the things that just strikes me, and I try to share this with my loved ones when I have the opportunity, and I see them posturing about those who are outsiders and those in this way, is how it's always so deeply rooted in fear. It's not rooted in strength and courage and trust in the Lord. It's rooted in fear. I'm afraid of these people or this situation. And if nothing else, I think the call here is for us to be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and dismayed. All right. That is it. So thank you all for your discussion. I appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan.